This is Algebra 1, Lesson 9.6, Factoring Special Cases. So we've been factoring quadratics, and now I just want to show you a couple shortcuts that you can use if you'd like. The first one is called the difference of two squares. We did this when we were multiplying binomials. We found that if you have the same first terms, the same second terms, but one's plus and one's minus, the middle term falls out and you end up with a difference of two squares. So if you start with two perfect squares with a minus sign in it, you know you're going to end up with two binomials, one with a plus and one with a minus. Let's look at an example. So I'm starting with x squared and 9 is one of our perfect squares. And when I'm saying perfect squares, that means 1 squared is 1, 2 squared is 4, 3 squared is 9, 4 squared is 16, 5 squared is 25, 6 squared is 36, etc. That's what we're talking about, perfect squared. And 9 is one of our perfect squares. And we have a subtraction sign. So you know when we factor this, one of them has to be positive, one of them has to be negative. That's the only way we can get a negative 9. But when we do the outside and the inside, it's going to fall out. So this is one of those special cases. Another special case you'll see, again you start with a perfect square, you end with a perfect square, but this time your middle term is plus 2 times those two terms together. You're going to end up with just a plus b quantity squared. If it's the same thing, you start with a perfect square, you end with a perfect square, but this time your middle term is minus 2ab, then when you factor, you're going to end up with a minus b quantity squared. Let's look at an example of that. So you can see here, I'm starting with a perfect square, I'm ending with a perfect square, and my middle term is plus the square root of the first and the square root of the second term added together. If you don't like that shortcut, you can always go back to the way we learned before. You can say I'm going to list all the factors of 16. So 1 times 16, 2 times 8, 3 doesn't go into 16, and 4 times 4. And we want our middle term to be the sum of those two would be 8, so obviously that's going to be 4 plus 4. Okay, instead of writing x plus 4 times x plus 4, the shortcut is just to say x plus 4 quantity squared. And the same is true for the next one. You can see we're starting with a perfect square, we're ending with a perfect square, and our middle term is going to be minus 2 times the square root of our two perfect squares. But again, if you don't like that, just say, hey, 36, I know that's 1 times 36, or 2 times 18, 3 times 12, 4 times 9, or 6 times 6. And when I add those two together, I want to get a negative 12. So it looks like we're going to use 6 times 6. And the only way you can end up with a product that's positive is both sides have to be the same. But when you add them together, you want a negative. So you can see we're going to end up with x minus 6 and x minus 6. Let's practice a couple. Here's the shortcut. You start with a perfect square, you end with a perfect square. There is no middle term. So you know this is the case where you're going to have x plus and an x minus. That's the only way you can multiply two numbers together and get a negative. And the square root of 4 is 2. Okay? If you forget that, just say, hey, what can I use? I could use 1 times 4 or 2 times 2. And I want my middle term to be 0, so you know 2 minus 2 gives us the 0. Okay, same thing here. We start with a perfect square, we end with a perfect square. You know we have to have 1 plus and 1 minus to multiply them together and get a negative. And the square root of 25 is 5. And if you forget that, just start. 1 times 25, 2 doesn't work, 3 doesn't work, 4 doesn't work, 5 times 5, there it is. Right. Here's the other example. You start with a perfect square, you end with a perfect square, and your middle term is plus 2 times the product of those two square roots. Okay, so again, let's look at this. 9 could be 1 times 9, 2 doesn't go into 9, 3 times 3. And so we want, when we add them together, to get 6. So you can see that's going to be this one. So we have x plus 6, 3, x plus 3, and x plus 3. And just to make that a little bit prettier, we just say x plus 3 quantity squared. And here's the same thing, but with a minus. We start with a perfect square, we end with a perfect square. So you know one of them has to be, they both have to be the same in order to get a product that's a positive. When we combine like terms, we want to get a negative, so we know they're both going to be minus. And it's a perfect square, so we could use 10 and 10. But if you forget that, just start at 1 and 100, 2 and 50, 3 doesn't go into it, 4 and 25, 5 times 20, 6 doesn't go into it, 7 doesn't go into it, 8 doesn't go into it, 9 doesn't go into it evenly, and 10 and 10. And you're looking for, when we combine them together, we get 20, so there it is. We want them to be negative. And again, the fancy way to write that is x minus 10 quantity squared. Okay, please try the practice problems. Let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.